Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this noon hour. My name is Garth Spellman, and I'm the curator of ornithology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And I am here today to share with you a little story about some museum treasures that we have in the ornithology collection at the museum. And the story I'm going to tell today, and the tale I will tell, is just a little one about some little island wrens that we have in our collection. So thank you for joining us, and I will get to the presentation, and then at the end, we'll take any of your questions. So I am going to start sharing my screen now. All right. So this is the story of the rise and fall of an exiled wren. The specimens that you see in this picture are specimens that we have in our collection that were collected in the year 1940. And these are little, I apologize, in the background, I just realized there's a siren going off close to my house. So if you hear that, I hope it doesn't cause any interference. But these are specimens that were collected in 1940, and they are found in our collection of extinct and rare birds that we have at the museum. And so we're going to learn a little bit about these little brown wrens and where they came from and how we got them at the museum and how we are using them, using some new and modern techniques to answer questions about their life and their demise. So this is a diorama in one of our bird halls at the museum, a picture of a diorama. This is the Isla Isabela Sanctuary. It is a bird sanctuary in the Tres Marias Islands off the coast of western Mexico. And there are frigate birds and gulls and boobies that you see that are breeding on these islands in the diorama. And this particular diorama was actually brought to the museum, and many of the specimens in it, from an expedition to the western Pacific coast of the United States and Mexico, a trip around the Baja Peninsula. And this trip occurred back in 1940. And here's a picture of Alfred M. Bailey, who was then the director of the Museum of Nature and Science, the Denver Museum of Natural History as it was known back then. That's him second in line right there. And they are boarding a boat called the Kinkajou. And this was a natural history expedition that the museum embarked upon. And it left from Los Angeles in the year 1940. And Alfred M. Bailey was a prolific writer for both popular and also scientific journals, and also gave lots of natural history lectures across the United States. But his account of this journey was published in National Geographic magazine back in 1942, after the exhibition had occurred. And the arrows on here show how they tracked from Los Angeles down across the Pacific Islands on the Kinkajou. And they traveled and they saw many places, and they did collect specimens that they brought back to the museum from this expedition. And it's important to note that, you know, expeditions like this are not frequent anymore, where you go and collect animals or anything from just a general area. Generally, we go on expeditions now in the scientific community to answer specific scientific questions, and not necessarily do these general practices of bringing animals back for display. We are going out to actually answer scientific questions and do research on those specimens. And the practices back then, and we see pictures that are things that we would not see on an expedition nowadays. And I bring your attention to the picture at the top up here. So there's a little cartoon showing one of the expedition participants is actually sitting on an elephant seal. And this is something that would not get past an institutional animal care and use committee now, where we make sure that we are practicing good scientific ethics. You don't do this anymore. But on this expedition was led by another naturalist and also a California oil magnate. This is John Pemberton that you see here right next to Alfred Bailey, who is driving the boat at this time. And he would lead expeditions off the coast of California for museums on the Kinkajou, which was his yacht. And on this journey, as they were coming back from Baja California, they decided to venture out to the Isla Revilla Gigedo. So this is an archipelago of 3 islands, about 300 miles south of the tip of Baja California. And one of those islands is the island of San Benedicto. This one featured right here. Now, this is what San Benedicto looks like from the air today. And it's a small island, only a couple of miles, so from tip to tip. And one of the most prominent features that you see on this island is the Barcena volcano. So this is a group of volcanic islands that formed out in the Pacific Ocean from Mexico. And the geology suggests that this is the youngest of those islands. It probably only emerged from the ocean anywhere from 60 to 55,000 years ago. So it's a very young island, according to the age of the Earth and standards. And it's really a spectacular island when it comes to biodiversity. The waters outside this island are just thick with ocean life, and it's an international diving destination to see manta ray and be able to swim among great white sharks and other large sea creatures. It's an amazing island, and it also has a pretty unique biodiversity that you find on land as well. So when you get out there, these are masked boobies that you see out on the island. And these were taken from this exhibition, so back in 1940. And this island is a huge seabird breeding colony. There are seabirds in the thousands that breed upon the island in complete isolation and solitude. There are no human inhabitants on the island. And so you can imagine this island, when they get there, is just roiling with a cacophony of sound from these seabirds. And this is Alfred and Bailey. This is him next to one of the masked boobies when he got out there, and you can see several of the other booby nests in the background. But the animals on the island were pretty tame, and you could just walk up to them and even pick them up if you wanted. They did not fear human encroachment. But while he was on this island, he remarks in this article in National Geographic about a very familiar sound that he heard over the cacophony of the seabirds. And this was the sound of a particular landbird that is quite striking, has a diversity of songs, and that is a rock wren. Now, rock wrens are found pretty well throughout Western North America. So this on the right here, that shows what their geographic distribution is, and this line across here shows the difference between, or the break between migratory populations in the north and non-migratory in the south. But the rock wrens are common birds that are found in arid and rocky outcroppings all throughout Western North America, from Central America all the way up into British Columbia and Canada. And they exhibit some interesting variation. As you move south, the birds get to be darker and more spotted. The birds that are really spotted here, this subspecies called Guttatus, are the ones found down in El Salvador and Costa Rica, and they're found on volcanic rocks. So you can imagine that natural selection has acted upon these animals in the past to blend in more with their volcanic rock backgrounds. Whereas the birds, as you get further north and are on sort of these sandstone yellowish rocks, are more grayish and buffish in color. So, but rock wrens are also prolific island colonizers. They've colonized most of the channel, or all the channel islands off the coast of Southern California, all the continental islands, islands that are in the continental shelf within or the Gulf of California and off the coast of Baja California. They've colonized this island out here in the yellow, which is Guadalupe Island. And then they had managed to get out here to this tiny island of San Benedicto south of Baja California. And it's really sort of a remarkable story of these birds being able to get out and colonize these islands. Well, this subspecies that was found on the island of San Benedicto of rock wren was named, it had been sampled about a few decades before Bailey had arrived on the island, and it was named Salpinctes obsoletus exul. And exul, that last name, means the exiled wren. So ornithologists kind of have sometimes we can be pretty creative in the names that we're talking about, but this was an exiled bird is what they believed. Now, these birds that we have in the museum collection turned out to be the last members of this subspecies of rock wren that were ever collected or seen by scientists. This was the last expedition that actually went out to the island and studied the avifauna that was out there. And 12 years after the expedition got to the island, the most prominent feature on that island, the Barcena volcano, exploded and erupted in what was then one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the Western Hemisphere. It was a massive eruption. The volcano on the island, there's evidence in the geological literature suggesting that the cinder cone on this island grew from about 300 feet high to 900 feet high in less than 3 months prior to the eruption of this volcano. That is how much pressure was building up underneath this island before it blew its top. And they knew it was going to happen because of this buildup and the increase in height of the volcano on the island. And this is a picture of the eruption almost as it occurred, about a second or two after it occurred. And so there was a ship that was out there to take pictures of the eruption. The eruption was so massive and scary that that ship was also trying to get away from the eruption as quickly as possible, because this is the island just totally engulfed in fumes and ash and I mean hot ash as that volcano erupted. And it just took over the island and enveloped the island in this massive cloud of toxic fumes and ash. Now, following that eruption, the eruption really, as you imagine, wiped out life on the island. So there's expeditions that went back to the island to look at it the year after the eruption. And there are notes in scientific journals of bird bones sticking up from the ash because seabirds were essentially, buried in this ash as the eruption occurred while they were sitting on their nests. You can imagine it as sort of an avian version of Pompeii in Italy in history. And I mean, these birds were devastated on the island. However, even that year after the eruption, they did find seabirds had recolonized the island. They came back and they started breeding. And, By 10 years, a decade afterward, there were more seabirds breeding on the island than there were before the eruption, by some estimates. However, of course, the landbird, this rock wren that managed to get out there and colonize this island, was lost forever. And we have never seen another rock wren on the island again. And so these little specimens that are at the museum really are a treasure. They're a record of this biodiversity that was there and lost. And so when I came to the museum, I became fascinated by these wrens and wanted to ask some questions about how different they were and when did they get there? And did they have a similar history to other island populations of wren? And to answer some of these questions, we're fortunate to have these specimens because they provide this historical data that would be lost if we didn't have the specimens in our collection. We wouldn't be able to answer questions about these animals. And so these historic museum specimens, they allow us to ask questions about insights into extinction or lost biodiversity, but they can also be used in other circumstances to look at evolution in response to anthropogenic changes that we see in our environment. But we're just going to talk about right now that sort of loss of biodiversity and what was it that we lost in this case. And I mean, there's some fascinating examples of evolution on islands. So like the kakapo and other birds and the dodo, when birds get out to these oceanic islands, oftentimes you get evolutionary patterns that sort of can be predictable in some of these birds. They get larger bodies and heavier legs and shorter wings as the number of predators goes down and the need to fly is sort of suppressed within the population. Well, evolution has a way of evolving similar morphologies, these tiny little wings and large bodied birds that evolve flightlessness. And so we see this often on these oceanic islands. And so part of our reasoning for wanting to study this little bird was to see, well, do we see any of the patterns that we might see in other species that get out to these distant oceanic islands? And so some researchers and I are working together on this, and I've even had teen interns working on some of the data and collecting some of this data. But the first thing we did was we wanted to look at the morphology, the appearance of these birds. Did it change at all when they got out to this island? Was evolution occurring in a certain way? And so we got 225 specimens from museums around the country to look at rock wrens and compare island rock wrens with those that you find on the continent. And so how we do this is we just measure some fine scale measures of the bird. You can measure their wing length, their wing chord and tail length and bill length and their tarsus length. And you can do all of these things to see how similar these birds are to one another. And so when we compare them, and I'm going to show you a plot and it looks like a mess, but this is all the birds that we measured. These are the populations that they come from on the right here. Each of the underlined population is an island, and the others are non-island populations. And this kind of looks like somebody shot a shotgun at a piece of paper. But there are some things that are pulled out of this. There are two groups that can be pretty well classified with 95 to 90% confidence they can be pulled out of the other groups. Now, one of these is an island population. These green ones are from Guadalupe Island, that other oceanic island of rock wrens that we find. And then the black, these are Central American birds. These are birds that are found down on those volcanic rocks down in Central America. So we are able to identify some morphology differences between rock wrens. But our San Benedicto Island ones are these light blue or cyan color, and those don't really get pulled out. So overall, they were pretty similar to what we see in general within rock wrens. So evolution or natural selection may not be acting on them so strongly. But we do see some other patterns if we just look at individual characters. So what this is a plot of, on this axis here, you have your hand wing index. This is a measure of how short and round a wing is. So if your hand wing index goes smaller, that means you have a short and a round wing. And that means you're not as good at flying long distances or powered flight as something that might have a longer, narrower wing. And what the other axis, the x-axis, is showing is the distance of those islands from the mainland. And what we see is that birds, the further out they get away from the mainland, their wings get shorter and stubbier. So where we see this pattern that these birds on distant islands may be evolving towards less powered flight or perhaps even flightlessness. And so San Benedicto is out here with this tiny little hand wing index, the short little stubby wings, suggesting that they're evolving in that way. Well, the great thing about having these specimens is that we can also extract DNA that is still found in their skin. And so we were able to do this at the museum. We were able to look at two different types of DNA in the birds. The first thing was a mitochondrial genome. So all the little powerhouses, mitochondria in your cells, have that little bit of DNA in it. And that DNA actually tells us, we were able to time the number of mutations that have occurred and date when the birds got out there. And they got out there about 50,000 years ago, pretty soon after that island emerged from the ocean. And then the other genetic data, this genomic data, data from the genes in your nucleus of your cells, it supports the distinction of the San Benedicto Island rock wren as being something pretty unique. And it's unfortunate that we lost it during that volcanic eruption. And this is just how we can see visually the genetics pulling apart populations. This is San Benedicto up here in this orangish color. So it really was a pretty unique animal that we lost that day that the Barcena volcano blew its top. We know that they were genetically distinct, but morphologically they seem to be evolving towards other island birds that we see. And they got out there right about when the island emerged from the ocean, and were pretty darn unique. And it's sad we lost them, but it's great that we can still learn about their history from these specimens we have in the museum. And so with that, I would love to answer any questions that you may have.
Hey, Garth.
Hello.
Hey, and hi, Facebook audience. My name is Memory. I am in the marketing department at the museum, and I'm just going to pop in and share your questions with Garth and get you all some answers. Okay, so I see we have one question, Garth, from Talia. She asks, did ostriches evolve on islands originally or in some form of isolation from predators? They have such large bodies and small wings.
That is a fascinating question, and they belong to a radiation of birds, the paleognats, that are extremely old ostriches, and they belong to this group with tinamous, which are these sort of chicken-sized body birds that you find down in South America and other places. And so those birds, and a lot of those large birds, when they arrived, so where they are, it is believed that their large size evolved because they did not have many predators. So, and therefore, they evolved this large size as a result of that. And if we go back in the tree of life and we look at the ancestor to all these huge flightless birds, so the data that we have suggests that their ancestors were volant or capable of flying. And so they probably were much smaller, right? And birds that were capable of flying and fleeing using flight from a predator. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right, we have a question from Michael. Michael asks, how is the 50,000 to date determined?
That's a great question. So there are certain genes that we know that we have in that mitochondrial genome where ornithologists have been able to identify the number of mutations that occur in a certain amount of time. And so you get about 2%, right, of the genome, of the gene, that particular gene, right, mutating every 2 million years. And so from that, we can use that information to date, so how long ago those birds got out to the island. And we call that a molecular clock is what we call it.
Molecular clock. Awesome. We have another question here from Josh. Josh asks, given the trend, could at least some of these wrens have evolved flightlessness if the volcanic eruption didn't happen?
That is a great question. And it's really tough to predict whether or not they would have evolved totally to flightlessness. San Benedicto was probably a perfect environment for that because there are no known, right, avian predators, flying avian predators that you find on this island. I mean, it was the seabirds and the rock wrens. So, and that was pretty much it. And so you're in an environment where you don't, you're not having to deal with those flying predators. In that case, so you probably have a perfect scenario for that to happen, but it would have taken a very long time.
That makes sense. Oh, we have about 2 more questions. I think we'll have time for both. Let's see. The first one comes from Sarah. She asks, does the smaller hand wing index occur less because it is selected for and more because a higher hand wing index it no longer selected for?
So some of the things you don't see as well in the data that I was showing, you actually see a larger hand wing index in migratory rock wrens than you do in rock wrens that are non-migratory. So that's another thing in the data that I don't show in the talk. And in terms of these island birds, I don't think you have a situation where there's natural selection for a smaller hand wing index. I think it's something that evolves because they are not using flight as much. It's an unuse sort of situation where you don't have natural selection favoring individuals that have longer wings and more powered flight. So it's sort of a lift, right? A lifting of the restrictions that natural selection might have on a population. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And how about we let this be our last question? Another one from Talia. Are there other species that have had their evolutionary trajectory altered or their extinction caused by a single event, other than the dinosaurs, of course? Yes. Thank you, Talia.
It's a difficult question to answer because, there are extinction events that happen quite frequently on the planet. It's, other things that I can think of off the top of my head, I can't think of many. I think one of the things that really drew me to this particular study when I first started looking into it is if you look across all the extinctions that we know in historic times, for example, most of those have their cause rooted in human causes and intervention. It might not be humans that cause them to go fully extinct, but it's certainly we are one of the triggers that are leading to that decline and other things. And in this case, this was a natural phenomenon where we lost, right, a special something. And we don't see that very often in nature. It's not something we see. And I think it's an important story to get out because of that. But it shouldn't diminish the fact that we really need to prevent extinctions and biodiversity loss. And of course there's some we can't help, like this one, but there's a lot that we can. And there's a lot we can do to prevent those extinctions from occurring.
Wonderful. That looks like our last question. So is there anything you want to leave us with as we close up?
No, I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about a wren that most people have probably never thought about or never even knew existed. And I hope you join us for other events. So more in the week and next in the weeks to come. And it was just a pleasure talking to everyone.